All right, let's take a look at the qualifying relative, which is the second type of dependent. To claim someone as a qualifying relative, the qualifying relative must meet the following tests, and we're going to look at these tests. And in addition to these four in the blue, like I had mentioned in the previous video, there are two other tests that they also have to meet, which are common to both the qualifying child and the qualifying relative. We're going to look at that in the very next video. So these are the four tests. Well, these are the three tests right here, 2, 3, 4, that are unique to qualifying relative. Test number one is just making sure that the person cannot be a qualifying child for someone else. So if a person can be a qualifying child of another taxpayer, they cannot be a qualifying relative. So let's take an example here. I took it right out of publication 17. Says your 2-year-old son lives with your parents and meets all the tests to be their qualifying child. He is not your qualifying relative. So because the child can be a qualifying child of someone else, they cannot be a qualifying relative. So again, the very first thing is, if the dependent can be a qualifying child for anyone, they are out of consideration for qualifying relative. So once we have that satisfied, and if we know that they cannot be a qualifying child for someone else, we look at the following tests, the following three tests. First one being the relationship test. Okay, now this is not the same relationship test that we looked at for the qualifying child. You'll notice it is different. So to meet this test, the qualifying relative must either be related to the taxpayer through a qualified relationship, and the relationships are listed in the publication 17. You can look them up online as well, and I'll go through some of those relationships. Or live with the taxpayer all year as a member of the taxpayer's household. Okay, so what does that mean? That means anyone, a friend, a foe, doesn't matter who. They don't have to be related. If they live with the taxpayer for the full year, they will satisfy this relationship test. So they have to live with the taxpayer for the full year. The same temporary absence applies here as well. If they're only away because of a temporary absence, which we looked at in the qualifying child. If you want, you can go back and look at that video again. Things like illness, travel, business, military service. If they're only temporarily away, then they will still meet the relationship test. Now, so the qualified relationships in the qualifying relative tests are much more broad. This includes almost all immediate family, so it's everything in the qualified child, plus it goes up higher. It also includes parents, grandparents, includes uncles, aunts, also includes mother-in-law, sister-in-law, brother-in-law, father-in-law. And one thing to note is, if a relationship is created by marriage, it is not destroyed through divorce. So your wife's father, who's your father-in-law, will still be a qualifying relative even if you divorce your wife and you're no longer married. That relationship still carries forward for tax purposes only. The second test is the income test. So the qualifying relative's gross income for the tax year cannot be more than the personal exemption amount. So for 2015, it's $4,000. But here, it's important to know it's not a dollar amount, it's the personal exemption. So each year, the personal exemption changes, and this amount changes also. So for 2015, the qualifying relative has to make less than $4,000. If they make more than $4,000 or more, they do not qualify again. They'll be knocked out because of not meeting this test. Now, gross income is all income that is not exempt from taxes. So anything that would be included in taxable income would also be considered, income for calculating the income for this test. So just keep that in mind. And the last test is the support test. Now, this is what I was talking about in the qualifying child video when I kept emphasizing the support being a negative support. Now, let's take a look at this. This says the taxpayer. See, this is the difference here. The taxpayer generally must provide more than half of the qualifying relative support. Okay, so now here's the part where I distinguish the two. Think of it as a positive support test. The taxpayer has to provide at least 50% of the support. So in the qualifying child support, the taxpayer did not have to provide the support. They just had to make sure that the child didn't provide more than 50% of their support. In this case, in the qualifying relative support test, the taxpayer has to be proactive and they have to support the qualifying relative and provide at least 50% of the qualifying relative support. So I hope you see the difference between the two support tests, between the qualifying child and the qualifying relative, and keep them distinct, do not confuse them. In the qualifying relative, the taxpayer has to support the qualifying relative, or else they cannot claim them as dependent. In the qualifying child, they don't necessarily have to support the dependent as long as they meet the other tests and the dependent does not the dependent does not provide more than 50% of their own support. There is one exception to this rule, which is the multiple support agreement. So the way the multiple support agreement works is that there are cases where multiple individuals provide support for a person, but no one has provided more than 50% of the support individually. So it could be, 5 people providing 20% each, or, any other mixture, but no one has provided more than 50%. In those cases, one person can still qualify for the support test, granted they provide at least 10% of the support and they meet all the other requirements of the qualifying relative. They also must, get a signed multiple support agreement from each of the taxpayers that also provided the support, and then they must store that with their records for the tax year. So again, to go over it, I'm gonna do an example. I think an example better illustrates it. So we have Abel, Beth, Carson, and Donald all provide support for their sister Zoe as follows. So Abel provided 30, Beth provided 40, Carson provided 25, and Donald provided 5. Now we know that no one provided more than 50% of the support. So as it is right now, no one can qualify to claim Zoe as a qualifying relative, even if they meet all the other tests, because they haven't satisfied the support test. So in a case like this, the multiple support agreement can be used by either Abel, Beth, or Carson, because they provided more than 10% of the support. You have to provide at least 10% of the support, at least 10% or more. So these three have provided more than 10%. Donald didn't, so Donald cannot. Abel, Beth, or Carson can claim the exemption if they meet the other requirements and if they can get a multiple support agreement from the others. So if, let's say, Abel wants to claim, and then if Abel can get Beth, Carson, and Donald to sign a multiple support agreement, then he can go ahead and still get the claim Zoe as a qualifying relative, because he would have met the support test through the multiple support agreement. Here's another example that we'll just take a quick look at to kind of tie it all together. Billy, a friend of Danielle, lived with Danielle all year. Danielle provided 50% of Billy's support. Over 50% of Billy's support. That is important. Billy had income from sales of his artwork of $3,000. Now, looking at these facts, we should come to the conclusion that Danielle can claim Billy as a qualifying relative because all of the tests are met as follows. First of all, Billy is not a qualifying child of anyone. Now, the way you would usually do that is either by asking or by deducing. When I say deducing, is by looking at the facts, by seeing if Billy lives with Danielle, then obviously he would not meet the abode test for someone else, so they would not be able to get them as a qualifying child. And when I say asking and deducing, you really have to ask the taxpayer these questions to come up with the answer. So this is satisfied. Relationship, they're not related, by blood, but again, it doesn't matter because the relationship test says if the person lives with the taxpayer for the whole year, they qualify. In this case, they did, so they meet the relationship test. Income has to be less than the personal exemption amount, which it is because the personal exemption amount is $4,000 for 2015. The last is support. Make sure that Danielle provides over 50% of the support for Billy, which is listed in the question. Generally, you're going to ask this by just asking the taxpayer and find out if they provide at least half of the support. There's usually a worksheet that could be filled out if it gets to that, but generally a taxpayer will know whether they did or they did not provide more than 50% of the support.